The first time Specialist Devin Crowe dropped the flag, nobody said a word. That was the protocol. You didn't shame a man in front of the formation. You let him retrieve it, reset, and try again. That was the Army way. Or, at least, that was supposed to be the Army way. The second time Devin Crowe dropped it, Sergeant First Class Maureen Adler pressed her lips together so hard they went white. The third time, the folded triangle of the American flag hit the concrete with a sound that seemed to swallow the entire parade ground one whole. It wasn't loud. Flags don't make loud sounds when they fall. It was the opposite of loud. A soft, muffled thud that somehow carried more weight than a gunshot. Every man and woman in that formation heard it. Every one of them felt it somewhere in the chest, in the place where pride lives before it gets complicated. Crowe stood there and stared at the flag on the ground. He was 22 years old. He had good hands, a pitcher's hands his recruiter had told him once, whatever that was supposed to mean. He had trained for this moment for 11 weeks. He had practiced the fold in his bunk at night in the dark using a towel because you weren't supposed to practice on an actual flag. He had done everything right, every step, every count. And now the flag was on the ground, and the ceremony was in 4 days. The centennial commemoration for Fort Bellingham was the biggest military event the Pacific Northwest had seen in 30 years. Senators would be there, generals, cameras from 3 national networks. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs had confirmed his attendance 2 weeks ago, and that confirmation had sent a quiet tremor of panic through the entire installation. This was not a ceremony where things went wrong. This was not a ceremony where flags touched the ground. Sergeant First Class Adler crouched down and picked up the flag herself, which was somehow worse than anything she could have said. She reset it in Crowe's hands, positioned his fingers with the precise impersonal efficiency of someone adjusting a machine part, and stepped back. "Again," she said. Crowe began the sequence again, 12 folds, each one precise, each one deliberate. His hands were steady until the moment they weren't. Until the 8th fold, when something in his grip shifted by a fraction of an inch and the whole structure began to loosen, and he tried to compensate, and in compensating he made it worse, and the flag came apart in his hands like something that had never wanted to hold together in the first place. Adler turned away, not in anger. She turned away because sometimes you had to. The rest of the honor guard team stood at parade rest along the back wall of the gymnasium, watching. Privates Marcus Whitfield and Jonah Seeley, Corporal Dana Holt, Private First Class Anthony Ruiz. None of them said anything, because there was nothing to say. They had their own problems. Whitfield had been dropping the rifle on the rifle detail. Holt had the angle wrong on her salute, held too long, which in the context of a formal ceremony created an awkward visual gap that Adler had described, in her particular way, as unprofessional beyond my ability to articulate. Ruiz had the pacing right and the posture right and the hands right, and he still somehow looked wrong when he marched, like a man who had memorized the idea of marching without quite absorbing the reality of it. 4 days. They had 4 days. Adler called a water break at 11:15. The team filed out through the side door onto the small concrete apron behind the gymnasium, where a folding table had been set up with water bottles and a thermos of black coffee that had been sitting there 7 in the morning. The coffee was terrible. They drank it anyway. Crowe sat down on the curb at the edge of the apron and put his face in his hands. Nobody approached him. That was also a kind of mercy. It was Ruiz who first noticed the old man. He was standing on the other side of the chain-link fence that separated the training area from the installation's east access road. Ruiz noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, a shape that doesn't belong to the context around it. The man was old. That was the first and most immediate fact about him. He was wearing dark green work pants, the kind you buy at a farm supply store, and a canvas jacket the color of old concrete, and he had a paper coffee cup in one hand and was watching the gymnasium door with an expression that Ruiz couldn't name. Not curiosity exactly, something older than curiosity. "Hey, Holt," Ruiz said quietly. Holt looked up from her water bottle. Ruiz tilted his head toward the fence. Holt looked. The old man was still there, still watching, still holding his coffee. He might have been 75, he might have been older. He had the kind of face that had stopped aging at some point and simply settled into itself. Deep lines, pale eyes, white hair cut close to the skull in a way that had once been a regulation cut and had simply never changed. "He's been there a while," Holt said. "I know. Is he allowed to be there?" "It's an access road, not restricted." They watched him for another moment. The old man didn't move. He wasn't watching them, exactly. He was watching the gymnasium door, which Adler had left propped open, and through which the sounds of the team's failures had been audible for the last 3 hours. Adler came outside and saw him immediately. Adler saw everything immediately. It was both her greatest professional quality and the thing that made her exhausting to be around. She walked to the fence. "Can I help you, sir?" The old man looked at her. His eyes were light grey, almost colourless, and they were very calm. "I don't think so," he said. "I was just walking." He held up the coffee cup slightly, as if that explained something. "This is a training area," Adler said. "The access road is technically open to base personnel," the old man said, not unkindly. "I know, I have a pass." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a laminated card, which he held up for her. Adler looked at it. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. "I apologize," she said. "I didn't mean to imply." "You didn't imply anything." He put the card back in his pocket. "You were doing your job." He looked past her toward the gymnasium door. "Flagfold," Adler paused. "Among other things." The old man nodded slowly. He took a sip of his coffee. He looked at the gymnasium door again, and then back at Adler, and he said, "The 8th fold." Adler went very still. "I'm sorry? The 8th fold is where they lose it," he said. "The first 7, they can think their way through. 8 is where the body has to take over. If the body doesn't know what to do by the time you reach 8, the hands start to compensate, and compensation is the beginning of the end." He shrugged, a small movement. "That's been true as long as there have been flag folds." Adler studied him for a long moment. She had been in the army for 16 years. She had met men who talked about things they knew, and men who talked about things they'd read, and she had learned to tell the difference. "You've done ceremony work," she said. "Some," he said. "When?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "Would you be willing to come inside?" His name was Harold Orrin Fitch, and he introduced himself to no one. Adler introduced him to the team as a former service member who's offered to help us. And he stood at the front of the gymnasium with his paper coffee cup and looked at the 5 young soldiers in front of him with the patient, assessing expression of a man who has seen this particular kind of struggle before and found it neither discouraging nor surprising. "I'm not going to talk much," he said. His voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a man who had given up on the idea that talking faster accomplished anything. "I'm going to show you some things. You watch, and then you do, questions at the end." He set the coffee cup on the floor beside him. Adler handed him the folded flag, and he took it in both hands and stood there for a moment, just holding it, eyes closed. If any of the young soldiers found that strange, they were professional enough not to show it. Then he began. The fold was the same fold they had all been taught, the same 12 steps, the same precise geometry, the same tradition that dated back further than any of them had been taught to ask about. But watching Harold Orrin Fitch perform, it was like watching a different act entirely. Not because he was fast. He wasn't. He was, if anything, slower than Crow, and Crow had been trying so hard to be careful that he'd bled all the life out of his movements. Fitch was slow the way deep water is slow, deliberate, unhurried. His hands moved as if they were operating on a frequency that bypassed the brain entirely, as if the knowledge lived somewhere older and quieter than thought. At the 8th fold, his hands did not hesitate. They had always hesitated there. Everyone's did at first, because the 8th fold requires a shift in the axis of the fold, a counterintuitive rotation that the mind wants to resist. You have to trust the position of your hands over the logic of your eyes. Fitch's hands trusted. They moved through the rotation as if the flag itself were guiding them, and he completed the remaining 4 folds in a single continuous motion that ended with the triangle sitting in his palms, tight and perfect and geometrically exact. He held it out for them to look at. Nobody said anything. "The 8th fold," Fitch said, "is where you stop thinking and start remembering." He looked at Crow. "How long have you been practicing?" 11 weeks, sir," Crow said. Fitch nodded. "Do you know what you've been doing for 11 weeks? Crow hesitated. "Training, sir. You've been arguing with your hands," Fitch said. "Every time you reach 8, your brain says the logic is wrong, and your hands listen to your brain instead of the fabric. Your hands are smarter than your brain on this. They've had 11 weeks. Let them work." He held the flag out to Crow. Again, Crow took the flag. He stood there for a moment, and something in Fitch's tone, or in the quality of the silence in that gymnasium, seemed to reach him in a way that 11 weeks of drills had not. He closed his eyes for a second, then he began. 1, 2, 3. Through 7 he was fine. Through 7 he had always been fine. The gymnasium was so quiet that the sound of the fabric was audible with each fold, a soft, precise whispering that was the sound of 11 weeks becoming something. 8. His hands moved. They rotated. They did not stop. 9, 10, 11, 12. The triangle sat in his hands, tight and perfect. Crow opened his eyes and looked down at what he was holding, and his face did something complicated that he immediately controlled, because he was a soldier and they were not alone. Fitch watched him for a moment. Then he said, "The hands, remember? That's what 11 weeks is for." They worked until 6 in the evening. Fitch stayed. Nobody asked him to. He simply stayed, moving from station to station. The fold with Crow, the rifle presentation with Whitfield, the timing sequence with Ruiz, the salute hold with Holt. And at each station he did the same thing. He watched, he identified the moment of failure, and then he showed them, once, what the movement looked like when the body had taken over from the brain. With Whitfield and the rifle, it was the grip. Whitfield was holding the M1 Garand the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping, which is the surest way to drop it. Fitch took the rifle from him, and the way he took it told you everything. The way a good carpenter picks up someone else's tool, immediately reading the weight and the balance, knowing where the centre of gravity lives. "How heavy is this rifle?" Fitch asked. 9.5 pounds, sir, Whitfield said. "Wrong," Fitch said pleasantly. "Right now, in your hands, it weighs about 40 pounds. Want to know why?" Whitfield did not answer, because it was clearly a rhetorical question. "Because you're fighting it," Fitch said. "A rifle in ceremony is not a weapon, it's not a tool, it's an extension of your attention, and attention doesn't weigh anything." He positioned Whitfield's hands here and here. "Don't grip, receive." He stepped back. Now, the difference was immediate and visible. Whitfield moved through the presentation with a fluidity that had been entirely absent 20 seconds ago, and when he completed the final movement, the rifle was exactly where it was supposed to be, precisely angled, not a degree off. Whitfield stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Fitch moved on without comment. That was his way. He didn't linger over successes any more than he lingered over failures. Both were simply information. Adler watched all of this from the side of the gymnasium, arms crossed, with the expression of someone revising an assessment in real time. She had been in the army for 16 years, and she knew what she was looking at. She was looking at someone who had done this. Not just ceremony work, but this, the teaching of it, for a very long time in very high-stakes contexts, and who had never stopped understanding what the stakes were about. At 5:30 she brought him a fresh cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway. He accepted it without making it a moment. "Fort Bellingham," he said, without looking at her. He was watching Ruiz work through the pacing sequence for the 4th time. Ruiz was getting it. You could see him getting it, the rhythm beginning to live in his body rather than his count. "I was stationed here," Fitch said, 1971, before all of this. He gestured vaguely at the newer construction to the south. "Most of what I remember is gone." "What unit?" Adler asked. He told her. She knew the unit. Anyone who'd done ceremony work knew that unit's history, even if they hadn't been trained in it. The unit had been dissolved in 1983, after the kind of operational record that earned a unit's name on a building somewhere, and then a quiet disbanding that was its own kind of honour, the honour of having been used up in exactly the way it was designed to be used. She looked at him differently after that, not with deference, Adler didn't do deference, but with a recalibration. "You're coming to the ceremony," she said. It was not a question. "I wasn't planning to," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her, those pale grey eyes. "I'm not a man who needs to attend ceremonies, Sergeant." "Wasn't thinking about what you need," Adler said. "These kids are going to perform in 4 days in front of 1,200 people and 2 television cameras. They need to know someone's watching who knows what it's supposed to look like." He was quiet for a moment. He watched Ruiz complete the sequence, pause, look up, find Fitch's eyes, and get a single small nod that seemed to mean something significant to the young man. "I'll think about it," Fitch said. He came into the ceremony. He did not sit in the designated seating area, where the senators and the generals and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs occupied a raised platform that had taken a grounds crew 3 days to construct. He sat in the 3rd row of general seating, on the end of a metal folding chair, in dark green work pants and the same canvas jacket, with a paper coffee cup that he must have gotten from somewhere before the ceremony began. The parade ground was full. 1,200 people was a conservative count. It was closer to 1500, the overflow crowd spreading back along the edge of the installation's main road, people who had driven from Bellingham and Anacortes and as far as Seattle, people who had served and people who had not but who had come. Because this kind of occasion still meant something to them. Because there are still enough Americans for whom the flag means something beyond politics. The honor guard entered from the east. Crow was at the front of the flag detail. He was 22 years old, and he was walking onto a parade ground in front of 1,500 people and 2 national cameras. And somewhere in the third row there was a man in a canvas jacket who had shown him what his hands already knew. He didn't drop the flag. He didn't come close to dropping the flag. He moved through the 12 folds with the same deep-water deliberateness that Fitch had shown him 3 days ago, and the fabric whispered with each fold the same way it had in the gymnasium. And at the 8th fold his hands moved without hesitation, the rotation happening as if it had always happened, as if his body had been waiting 11 weeks for permission to remember. The triangle sat in his hands, tight and perfect. He presented it to the senior officer, and the senior officer received it, and there was a moment, the kind of moment that doesn't happen on camera, but that everyone in the crowd felt anyway, where the weight of what that folded flag represents passed between 2 sets of hands, and the air on the parade ground felt different. Whitfield didn't drop the rifle. Ruiz had the pacing exact. Holt held the salute for precisely the right duration. When it was over, when the final notes of taps had died away, and the crowd was rising from their chairs in the particular slow way that people rise at the end of something that has moved them, Adler walked toward the third row. The folding chair was empty. She looked around the dispersing crowd, scanning the edges, the side roads. She caught a glimpse of canvas jacket moving toward the east gate, a paper cup in one hand. A man walking at the unhurried pace of someone who has been places and done things, and no longer needs to announce his departure. She thought about calling after him. She didn't. She stood there and watched him go, and then she turned back to her team, to Crow and Whitfield and Holt and Ruiz and Seeley, who were standing at ease near the ceremonial area, their uniforms perfect, their faces showing the particular expression that comes after. You have done something hard and done it right, that complicated mixture of relief and pride and exhaustion and something else that doesn't have a clean name. Good work, she told them. It was not a thing she said often, which was why it meant something when she said it. Crow was looking toward the east gate. Who was he asked. Adler considered the question. She thought about what the man had told her, the unit, the years, the operations that had been removed from the public record because some records are kept in other ways, kept in the muscle memory of men who are still walking around and drinking bad coffee and watching from the other side of fences. Someone who knew what it was supposed to look like, she said. Crow nodded slowly. He was still looking toward the gate. The crowd was thinning. The senators were being escorted to their vehicles. The cameras were being packed away. The parade ground was becoming itself again. Just ground, just space, the ceremony already transitioning from present moment to permanent record. I didn't get his name, Crow said. I know, Adler said. She didn't tell him that she had the name. She didn't tell him about the unit or the years or the operations. She didn't tell him that the laminated pass the old man had shown her at the fence bore a designation that she had only seen twice in 16 years. A designation that meant that Harold Orrin Fitch had clearance to walk onto any US military installation in the continental United States, any time, any day, for reasons that were not required to be explained. She didn't tell him any of that. Some things you learn in time, and some things you learn from watching, and some things you only understand once your hands remember something brain had almost let go of. What she said was, "Get some rest. We've got cleanup formation at 0700. Crow smiled, a small smile, the smile of a man who has just done something he wasn't sure he could do. Yes, Sergeant. Harold Orrin Fitch drove back to the town of Quilcene in a truck that was 14 years old and ran perfectly because he maintained it with the same precision he applied to everything else. He lived alone in a house at the end of a gravel road, not because he was hiding from anything, but because quiet had become the condition he did his best thinking in, and there was a lot he still wanted to think about. He made coffee when he got home. Real coffee, not from a machine, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not because he was sad, but because some days end better in the dark, where you can hear the trees and the creek and the absence of the things that used to make noise. He thought about the young soldier with the pitcher's hands, the way the eighth fold had finally happened for him, the way you could see the exact moment when the hands took over from the brain. He thought about how that moment looked from the outside, quiet, almost invisible, just a barely perceptible change in the quality of the movement. And how enormous it was from the inside, how enormous it must have felt on that parade ground, in front of 1,500 people, when the hands remembered and the flag held together, and 11 weeks of work became something worth the time it had taken. He had not watched ceremonies in a long time. He had thought that part of his life was finished. The ceremonies, the formations, the watching from the outside that was its own kind of service. He had thought that what he knew was his to keep, now, locked up in his hands and his body, a private inheritance from the years that had shaped him. But hands don't want to keep things to themselves. That was the thing he'd forgotten, somewhere along the long road from young to old. Hands want to pass things on. That's what they were made for. The grip transfers. The fold demonstrates. The weight of a rifle passes from one set of hands to another, and something that lives in the body moves with it, older than any of them, older than the unit or the installation or the flag itself. He drank his coffee. Outside, the creek ran the way it always ran, indifferent and constant, carrying the mountain down to the sea a molecule at a time, doing its work without ceremony, without an audience, without needing to know that it was doing it right. The body remembers, he thought. That's the whole of it. Everything else is just waiting for the body to remember. He sat there for a while longer. Then he washed his cup, the way he always washed it, set it on the rack the way he always set it, turned off the light and went to bed. He slept well. He usually did.